the 515th in our series of distinguished speaker programs. I'm Cindy O'Connell, and I have the privilege of being your club president. My privilege and our privilege is to love to welcome Craig Fugate to the podium.
Good afternoon. Great to be back in Tallahassee. You know, it was always a joy to be here throughout my tenure. My stepdaughter actually attended FSU, so go Knowles. So I was asked to talk about hurricane season, and I have two goals today. One, to be informative, and two, make some of you squirm in your seats. So I borrow from our great philosopher, Jimmy Buffett, to talk about this hurricane season and past. The picture is a waterfront view of Cedar Key. There's a dock there that's kind of messed up. You as taxpayers have rebuilt that dock in my career, I think now 6 times. And the reason you rebuilt it 6 times is it's a county-owned property. Levy County is self-insured. They don't have insurance. You pay. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. Now, this is our hurricane history going back to the 1850s of known tracks. Florida's pretty much hammered there. And not really surprising given our location with the majority of these storms coming either out of the Cape Verde Islands, those tracks, those long tracks that come across, or those that form rapidly in the Gulf of Mexico and impact a state such as Michael. But since we've been tracking disaster declarations, since about 1953, this is from FEMA's database, you can get this online, Florida's had about 132 declarations. Quite a bit of those are for fires, but these are the lesser declarations we do in the severe fire seasons. But 41 hurricanes have been declared under various federal programs since 1953. I was asked to talk about the seasonal outlook, and Troy and everybody else who's reading his pager back there knows my view on the outlook is, other than it is a good device to tell you it's hurricane season, has absolutely squat to do with what you do to get ready for hurricane season. The seasonal forecast this year kind of says, you got about equal chances of being below average, above average, or average. The one thing the seasonal forecast doesn't ever tell you is your house going to get hit? Now, when they issue that forecast, I'll be interested. But seasonal forecast, the science is really what I find fascinating. Because as we looked at what was driving seasonal forecast, it starts explaining why Florida has gone through relatively long periods of quiet activity and then a lot of activity very close together. And when you look back upon our known history, it's about a 20 to 30 year cycle, or at least it used to be about a 20 to 30 year cycle. One of those cycles was from about the mid-60s up until about Hurricane Andrew. It was one of the least active periods in Florida history for landfalling hurricanes. It also corresponded with some of the most rapid growth the state experienced, going from a population in the 50s, when I think there were still more cows in Florida than were people, to 12 million plus, and then rapidly moving up to where we are today. And so the seasonal forecast itself, I always ask this question: what are you going to do differently this year based upon that forecast? And I've been in briefings where the president was briefed by NOAA that we're going to have an extremely active season in 2010, and they used all of my time explaining that. And so when the president got to me, I had about 5 minutes left, and he said, "Craig, what are we going to do different this year?" I said, "Nothing." And he blinked and looked at me and says, he got it. You get ready for hurricane season irregardless of the forecast. And what was interesting about it, 2010 was a very active season for the Atlantic. Nothing made landfall. To the public, it was considered a bust. So remember, these forecasts, there is good science behind it. It does help us understand why we have quiet years and active years. But Hurricane Andrew was in a quiet year. So that's the seasonal outlook this year. And then Hurricane Andrew. Up until Hurricane Andrew, the three hurricanes that I think defined Florida occurred in the 20s and 30s. The Great Miami Hurricane, which if you normalize for today's dollars and population is about a $150 billion disaster. You had the Lake Okeechobee hurricane that killed, now estimates, over 1,800 people drowned in that hurricane, one of the largest loss of lives from a storm in Florida. And the first recorded Category 5 hurricane in 1935 to hit the U.S., which struck the Florida Keys and devastated Islamorada. And all of these hurricanes really shaped our history and to a certain degree shaped how and where we were building. If you remember what the Miami looked like and South Florida looked like in the late 50s and early 60s, most homes were single-story concrete block construction, flat roofs, jalousie windows, and terrazzo floors. Hurricanes come in, you just bleach down the walls and floors, hose them out, and you move back in. But when we had that quiet period, things started changing. We had a lot more immigrants from up north moving down here. We started seeing the type of construction changing based upon consumer demands. We started seeing a lot of things that the question I want to ask is, how much of that would have been done if we were still seeing the level of that hurricane activity we're seeing today? If you look at just Andrew, it dehoused about 26,000 homes. Think about that. This was back in 91. We lost 26,000 homes, over 100,000 were pretty much damaged and weren't habitable until major repairs were made. And this was our second Category 5 hurricane. Originally it was a Category 4, but during reanalysis they upgraded it to a Category 5 on the 10-year anniversary of that storm. But it was like Michael, very powerful, but fortunately a small hurricane. If it had been much larger or hit further north, that would have been an entirely different number. And if you remember in 1991, that summer, Governor Childs had to keep bringing the session back in because we couldn't get a budget because we were flat out broke. We didn't have reserves, we didn't have money, and then we get hit with one of the most devastating modern disasters. And the cost to the state was phenomenal. But it's also what I consider the beginning of the modern era of emergency management in the state of Florida. We had emergency management before that, but like with many things, it was what I would call a paper program. There weren't real capabilities. Many of the lessons that we saw from this, again, the late Governor Childs took an approach that I wish more politicians would take, and I don't really think of Governor Childs as so much a politician as an elected leader. But rather than identifying people to fire because things went wrong, he did something different. He asked former Senate President Phil Lewis to bring together a bunch of subject matter experts, both at the local, state, federal partners, community leaders, and ask a different question. Not what went wrong, but what will we do differently? What lessons have we learned? And out of that came the Lewis Commission report with over 99 recommendations. We had significant amendments to the Florida Statute 252, clarifying roles and responsibilities, putting in there additional protections and responsibilities for everything from nursing homes and hospitals all the way up to how the state did our business. But it also destroyed the insurance industry. Up until that point, Florida was a relatively easy state to write homeowner policies in. They suffered more losses from fires than they did from hurricanes, and the price of the products didn't support the cost of the risk. And after Hurricane Andrew, after several very large companies almost went bankrupt, the decision was made they were pulling out of the market, which would have been devastating to our economy. Compromises were made. We came up with some interesting tools in Florida, one which was a catastrophic fund to reinsure insurance companies, who promptly said, we'll take your product, but we're no longer going to be in your state. What do you mean? We're going to create subsidiaries. And those subsidiaries will use your CAT fund and serve your state, but if you fail, we're not taking down our companies anymore. They'll fail and you'll deal with it. So anybody's got Allstate, State Farm, anything else, you do not have the mainline product. It's State Farm of Florida. It's Allstate of Florida. They're derivatives of the company, firewalled against that. We did take a look at building codes. Now in South Florida, particularly the Miami-Dade codes, are some of the most strict in the nation, but without enforcement, they're worthless. So we began looking at the Florida legislature, and I always like to point out people hate red tape, and I'm not a big fan of it, but There was this Republican guy got in office, and he got a lot of this stuff was still in works after Hurricane Andrew, and he kind of looked at this stuff and said, you know, I can support a little red tape if it means we can keep the insurance industry here. So Governor Bush supported the legislature's effort to come up with the first statewide unified building code that created codes for enforcement in all 67 counties, requirements for codes enforcement inspectors, and began adopting more stringent codes. That pays off in a couple of years. We'll get to that. We also started seeing the insurance industry creating hurricane deductibles, which surprised a lot of people who were used to their standard deductibles until we started seeing a couple of storms came in, particularly by about 95 with Opal and some others, and they're going, hey, wait a minute, I thought my deductible was like $1,000. Oh no, you have a hurricane deductible. You were in a hurricane-warned area, so now we have a bigger deductible. What's that? That prompted the insurance commissioner's office to do a better job of full disclosure so people know what their deductibles are. And we got into the insurance business because the insurance industry could no longer write some of the properties. They were just too risky. And I like how we always make insurance companies the villains in this, and I like to remind people, insurance companies are not nonprofits. If they cannot make a profit on the policy, they cannot write it. They have responsibility to shareholders. Many of you, particularly if you got any retirement funds, are invested in insurance companies. It used to be considered one of the safest places to park money. And insurance companies are not charities. If they cannot manage the risk, they don't write the policy. But on the other hand, if they don't write the policy, they don't make money. So if we find ourselves in the state running an insurance company, there's a problem. We have the uninsurables. These were like the DUIs of houses. We had to provide something because the exposure and the mortgages were too great. People were locked into situations where they couldn't walk away from their homes, yet they couldn't get affordable insurance, or they couldn't even get insurance, period. So we created the insurance company of last resort. Unfortunately, many things that government does with good intentions don't work out that way. Citizens rapidly became the insurance company of first choice. And you, as Florida residents, own most of that exposure. And then here comes Hurricane 4, season of 2004. 4 hurricanes made secession landfalls in the state of Florida. Hurricane Charlie, a Cat 4. Hurricane Florence, a slow-moving Cat 2, Cat 1. Ivan, which was the first major hurricane to hit the Pensacola region since about the 20s. And then Gene, who hit hit up there about 12 miles from where Florence made landfall. And I love hurricane history in Florida. I love folklore. And I love hearing from old-time residents tell me about how they just don't have a hurricane problem. Because I tell you, everybody I ever talked to north of Palm Beach says we don't get hit by hurricanes because they curve out. If you ever looked at the state, they curve out. They don't hit us. Until basically Florence and Gene hit within 12 miles of each other. Same thing about the folks down in Charlotte County. They were proud to say we've never been hit by a hurricane. I said, you weren't even a county until the 20s. And they got Charlie. So those folks that said I've lived here all my life, we don't have a hurricane problem. I've also been back there and hear the same thing from them going, I never knew it could be this bad. I'm like, what was I trying to tell you? But this was an interesting year that we saw some of the first homes built under the building code. And it was dramatic. And as much as I flew over Florida that year, I could almost tell you when a house was built. Because side by side, the ones that had blue tarps were built prior to the implementation of the Unified Building Code. Those built after the Unified Building Code generally were pretty intact. We had a house in Ponta Gorda that was right on the water. You would expect it to be the home that was hit the hardest because the strongest winds were there. We were doing a street walk with President Bush and Governor Bush, and we get to this house, and about the only damage you can see is they had just put out the sod, those big rolls, and we thought they weren't finished, and the people there said, oh no, it was laid out, it just rolled back up. But the home had virtually no exterior damage. And Governor Bush was, looking at it, and the president looks at it, the president looks at the governor and says, what gives? And the governor's answer was pretty good. He said, building codes. It was a newer home. And in many cases, it was showing the value of making these decisions to implement a little bit more red tape was actually saving homes, which the hardest thing to do in a disaster is rebuild housing and provide temporary housing fast enough. We're experiencing this in the Panhandle. And if our goal is to have a good temporary housing program, we're going to fail. We need to have good housing stock that's survivable in the first place, and, by the way, affordable. And so we spent a lot of time that year in the hurricane response in the State Emergency Operations Center. This was probably, for me, I consider one of the crowning moments of my career, that we were working as a state team. One of the big lessons we learned from Hurricane Andrew was, if we respond as a collection of agencies, we're going to fail. But we also learned in 2004, government can't do it by ourselves. We needed to engage the private sector more meaningfully. And so I got to meet a lot of interesting characters like Dave Micah, because it turns out without diesel, generators don't run. And we had to start working with partnership with our fuel distributors. And there's no one point you can point to there. They're pretty much about as diversified as any other organization in the industry. But with power outages and disruptions, we found increasingly that a government-centric approach wasn't enough. We needed to bring in the private sector as part of the team, because the faster they got up and running, the better we could focus on the hardest hit areas. And so that starts another odyssey for me, was how do you engage the private sector? And I'm government. Our general way we engage the private sector is either through extortion or bribes. We either tax them, regulate them, or offer them money, grants, and tax credits. That's not exactly how you build a good partnership. But by 2005, we got hit several times. Dennis was one of the earliest Cat 3s. And then we ended up with Wilma, which knocked out more power in Florida than just about any other storm we've ever seen, pretty much in the nation. And it was during that we found that our private sector partners were learning the lessons faster than government. We were putting out quite a bit of stuff, free, food, water, ice in these disasters. But our state companies, like Publix, were getting open about as fast as we could get stuff down there. Governor Bush likes to remind me of the story of him being down in Miami at one of our, we call them points of distribution. Actually, it's like a beer barn. You drive in, they throw the stuff in your trunk, and you drive out. He was down at one of those, and he was saying, it seems to be going pretty good. Lines aren't too low. People are getting what they want. People seem to, we're meeting expectations. He said, but you're handing the stuff out in the parking lot of an open Publix, and they're eating fast food. I'm like, yes, sir. And it turned out Publix wasn't waiting for the power to come back on. As a corporation, they had already learned their lessons. They were hauling in generators. In fact, Publix made one of the biggest investments after these hurricane seasons to install permanent generators at their stores to run the whole store, not just the emergency systems. And again, we increasingly saw that the public sector was doing a much better job in many cases of getting things open that government previously thought we had to do. Turned out we shouldn't have been in Miami, in Palm Beach, and a bunch of other areas that we were set up. We should have been in Pahokee and Belle Glades, because they didn't have the big box stores, and their communities didn't have the resources. And so probably I think the most important lesson I learned from that was we had to stop competing with the private sector and ask them what we can do to help them get open, and ask them where they're not going to be able to get open, and focus our efforts there. And that lesson served me well going to FEMA. So out of those hurricanes, we updated our building code. And again, we saw that not only was it making an impact in those seasons, it's made impacts every year since. I remember Governor Scott was down in the Keys, and there was the slab home, the home that was all beat up, and the home that looked pretty good all next to each other. The only difference in those three homes wasn't the weather, because they were all next to each other. One was built in the 90s, slab on grade, destroyed. One was built after Hurricane Andrew, but not to the higher codes, a lot of damage. Those that were built after 2004, pretty much once we got utilities hooked back up, they were habitable. And we've had a lot more activity, but then in 2017, we get Irma. And Irma is interesting to me that most recently, if you remember all the debate going on in Congress about supplemental disaster funds, that's the number for Florida. That's how much, as taxpayers, you're paying the state of Florida for uninsured losses. That doesn't count total losses. This does not count loss of income. This does not count anything that impacted businesses. This does not count the insurance losses. This is, as a taxpayer, what you're subsidizing Florida for from just one hurricane, over $8 billion. And this trend continues. 2018, it looked like Florida may get off this year. Florence was north and we saw that, but then here comes Michael. And I think the thing that was most noticeable about Michael to me was there was nothing unusual about it. Most people were like, this is like, never seen this happen. I'm like, where were you for Opal? Opal was sitting down off the Yucatan doing nothing. Next thing we know, we got a Cat 4 heading right for the Panhandle, and I-10 was under construction. State of Florida thought we were going to need a lot more body bags. Fortunately, it weakened at landfall. And I think too many people were used to this idea of these storms that rapidly intensify, race to the Panhandle, were always going to weaken. And I'm like, where was that written down at? The only saving grace of Michael was where it did hit. A little bit further towards the west, the numbers would have been much worse. Problem where it did hit is economically most challenging because they were struggling economically before it hit, particularly Jackson County, Calhoun, the interior there, which is basically prisons, pine trees, and agriculture. And it hit all three of them. Tyndall Air Force Base, I don't care how much they promise to spend money on it, the most immediate limiting factor for Tyndall Air Force Base is housing. And again, we're seeing housing as a limiting factor both for our recovery, but also for national security. Which goes back to where and how we build things is an important determination of our ability to recover. Now this is just one storm. Already is projected at 1.2 billion, and that number will climb. Again, this is not FEMA's money. This is your money. And this trend is not abating. We continue to see the cost go up. How many people here know what FEMA pays for? Other than Lisa. The only thing FEMA pays for are uninsured losses. FEMA does not reimburse anything that's insured. So if you have a school district that is in a state pool and they have insurance, FEMA doesn't pay for that school district. School district right next door has no insurance or is self-insured. You as a taxpayer are paying no less than 75% of those rebuilding costs. And it is not what was there. It's what it costs to replace it. So we have seen this trend, and I've watched this growing up, of a shift from insurance being the primary model of managing risk in government to FEMA and federal disaster assistance bailing governments out. Because local governments are no longer, and to a certain degree, the state of Florida a little bit better because we do run an actually based insurance program. But the vast majority of what you're paying as taxpayers is because we've shifted the burden from using insurance to manage risk to you underwriting it far below the point in which local governments are inclined to change. And I like to refer to this as disaster socialism. Because here's my question. If there was no FEMA, there was no federal disaster assistance, and I just came from Japan. Japan does not have a disaster bailout program. Their governments maintain their own insurance policies. So when all those big earthquakes and tsunamis occur, the only real cost to the government is emergency response. The rebuilding is insured losses. What would Florida look like today if you didn't have a federal government bailout? Would we have made the same decisions and built the same way? Think about that $8 billion just for Irma. And that's not just FEMA, that's HUD, that's Army Corps of Engineers, the whole acronym. And ask the question, could we have done something better with $8 billion? Like pay down our debt. And we've gotten to this point where we've got a mismatch. We built the environment we have. We can't change it overnight. But I do ask this question, why are disasters getting more costly? Why is federal taxpayers, and it's not just Florida, it's a lot of other states too, why are the costs going up so much? You know, a lot of people will say, well, it's climate change. Well, there's some climate signals in there. But most of this is what I call avoidable risk. It's where we built and how we built that creates the exposure. Now, I'm not one to say I shouldn't be building where I want to build. I'm just saying I'm a capitalist. Build whatever you want to build. Just don't expect me to underwrite your risk. But as long as we continue to underwrite risk, we've set the bar so low, we're not seeing a change in behavior. To the point where, As much as Florida has the #1 rating for building codes in the nation, we kind of took a step back in 2017. I'm not sure we'd have done it if our session was after hurricane season, but where we had an automatic, we were updating every 3 years to International Code Council, we decided that was too burdensome, too much red tape. We should go back to, we'll look at it every 3 years, and if it makes sense, we may adopt it. I'm not sure how that's going to work out. So the past isn't preparing us for what's happening. We do know that building codes and land use planning work, but that means you got to tell people no. You can't build there that way. And people hate that answer. I'm like, well, let's make it real easy. Let's just get rid of the government bailouts and you take the risk with the private sector. And if the private sector can figure out how to insure the risk, why should I stand in your way? But as long as I'm a taxpayer and I'm underwriting your risk, I got to ask a question. What's the public interest there? And buy flood insurance. That program is so screwed up. When I ran FEMA, it was like, my first thing when I walked in, we ought to just abolish this. And my staff out, is he serious? And they're going, yeah, he's serious, but it is what it is. We have, and this is, I thought Citizens was bad. Our exposure in the flood insurance program just on the East Coast is over $1 trillion. And you own that. The flood insurance program was supposed to be actuarially based. However, when you have a board of directors of 500 plus, they were more interested in making sure it's affordable. And so we actually, in most cases, have priced flood insurance below what the market would provide. Private sector got out in the 60s, the federal government got in with all good intentions to provide flood insurance as a stopgap measure to provide it to people that already built an area subject to flooding, with the idea that at some point that we'd get them back in the market. And just like Citizens, that didn't happen. It just grew and grew. Most recently, it was actually at the borrowing limit when Harvey was hitting. Congress forgave $16 billion of the debt. That means you basically wrote off $16 billion out of your taxes. Still over $20 billion in debt. It's not sound. It's not sustainable. But we got to keep it because we got folks that if we didn't have flood insurance, we'd have nothing left. But I got a novel suggestion for you. Let's quit writing flood insurance for new construction. Again, if you want to build it there, be my guest. If the private sector will write the policy, then that's a great plan. But as long as we're providing flood insurance below what it costs and subsidizing growth in the areas that aren't sustainable, we're not going to be a resilient state. And people talk about resilience in all kinds of funny ways. I talk about it real simply. We won't have resilient tax bases. Go talk to the good folks in Calhoun County about their resilient tax base. They've lost assessed value. At the same time, their costs have skyrocketed. We're seeing the same thing in Jackson. To a certain degree, Bay is going to be okay because nothing else. We always go back to the beaches and the military ain't moving. But in other parts of the state, that's not always the case. President Obama, on the day that Sandy made landfall, the day after we were going up New Jersey, did two things to me. He asked me to stay for a second term, which I agreed, and he said, climate change debate is over, we got to talk about adaptation. Too many people are still fighting that battle. I'm like, the problem with that battle is we're not doing what we need to do now to adapt. And I don't really care what your belief is about climate change. The numbers aren't lying. Moody sent out a letter to investors that buying municipal and state bonds in states that are not addressing the impact of climate change may be a bad idea because states and cities may no longer be able to service their debt if they're having increasing disasters. And they're having to spend tremendous amounts of money for mitigation, like Miami Beach did with a $300 million bond issue just to deal with their sea level rise. So the problem is, as long as we're arguing about what's causing it, how much it's happening, and where it's occurring, we're missing our window of opportunity. Florida will be the sore thumb in the middle of all of this. We're going to get hit no matter what we do. We've taken some steps that have made us more resilient than a lot of other steps, but it probably isn't enough. And the question is, how do we finance it, price it, who pays? And I come back to a simple idea. When we're building new stuff, we should use the golden rule. If the insurance companies won't insure it, we don't subsidize it. That will not stop growth, but we'll ensure that growth that does occur does not add to our tax burden and will most likely still be part of the community paying taxes afterwards. Local governments and state government, really, this is, I think, our challenge. How do we ensure, as we're making all these changes, that our tax base is resilient against future risk, which is hard to define in some cases? So with that, it's your lunch. I gave you a indigestion. This is my contact information. I'm pretty much still in the policy space, but again, I cannot implore this enough. Buy flood insurance. Buy it now. It takes 30 days to be in effect. Your homeowner policy does not cover damage from rising water, and too many of you think you don't live in a flood zone. When you dump 3 feet of water, everything floods. And too many people have found out the hard way that that policy they've been paying for decades and always had good service from the insurance company will not provide them the first penny if the damage is due to rising water. Do not make a mistake and risk your financial savings in your home by saying, I don't live in a flood zone. It's not that expensive. You're not in the high-risk areas. Too much in Florida. I mean, our highest elevations in Walton counties, folks. There ain't that. I mean, how many times I was here in Tallahassee when Jim Cantori fell out of the canoe and almost drowned. Remember that? When we had all the flooding around here, and the Weather Channel's out, one of the subdivisions underwater, and Cantori's out. I think he was in a little John boat, fell out of it. Don't be those folks. Get flood insurance. Encourage folks to get flood insurance. If we're going to build resiliency, the first step is making sure you have the proper insurance so you can rebuild your home and not be dependent upon federal bailouts to provide that assistance, because it's too little and too late for most folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure this has prompted some questions, and we'll take first from our members, if you have any questions.
Mr. Fugate, thank you first off for speaking to us today. You're an iconic figure. You did a spectacular job all the years you were with us and with me, so we really appreciate you.
Thank you, sir.
And I was at Associated Industries in Florida when we had to fight with Senator Charlie Clary. He wanted to create and did carve out an exemption for the panhandle of the South Florida Building Code. So I support 100% what you're saying. But let's think about the non-rich people that own property at the coast. So as a policy consultant, what would you tell Florida governor and the Florida legislature? How do we balance the property rights of somebody that's been there in Mexico City for 40 years? The property's worth more than what the house was. The house is destroyed. They can't rebuild at the South Florida Building Code because it'll be too expensive. Same thing in the Florida Keys. So where's that balance, and how would you recommend a solution for us going forward? And there's going to be a lot of people in Florida that will be impacted that aren't well off enough to be able to build to the South Florida Code.
Well, that's the challenge of pricing risk. You're going to tell people no. So if it's in the state's interest to keep people there, if you build it back crappy, you're just setting them up to fail. So get off your pocketbook and spend your HUD dollars. State of Florida, that $8 billion, there's a lot of HUD money there. The state can take that with whatever they get from the other programs and build those houses back to code. State of Louisiana, Governor Edwards did this, and most of his folks that flooded in 2016 didn't have flood insurance. We spent over $1 billion of your tax dollars in the first 30 days on housing assistance, and those people didn't have flood insurance, so they weren't going to be able to rebuild their homes. And he took the HUD dollars he got and programmed them to do that. So if you go back in the HUD program, you'll find that there are dollars in there for building affordable housing to code. So this stuff about we got to weaken the code because we can't make poor people live in safe houses is pretty arrogant to me. We can take our HUD dollars and help them rebuild the code. Anything less, I think, is criminal negligence, because we know what's going to happen. And trust me, I've been around a while. I kayak all over that area. I mean, I would put in at Carabel at the DOT park and paddle out the Dog Island. So I know the area, and that's all Florida. And if you think it's not going to change, you're fooling yourself. But if you want to make a policy statement about making sure that people that are staying there can rebuild safely, but they can't afford it, you got over $8 billion. A big chunk of that's HUD money. The legislature and the governor can put that money forth and make sure homes are built to code. Floridians need to take back our state and start thinking about how we grow wealth here, not just build more houses. We can no longer count on net migration of people moving here to be our economic engine. That point is past. If we want to be competitive in a resilient state, we want to go through the next recession without getting the flu while everybody else has a cold, then we need to diversify and we need to think long term. How does the state of Florida grow wealth, not just build more stuff?